This week we're once again improving the fit of short row heels and peasant heels, this time by widening the instep. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. So as mentioned in the previous videos, the primary fit issue with short row heels and peasant heels is that they are too snug around the circumference of the sock at the heel diagonal. So that circumference is made of two parts. It's made of the instep, the width of the instep, and then it's made up of the measurement across this diagonal around the back of the heel. So to change the circumference, we need to change this measurement across the diagonal, or we need to change the measurement of the instep, or we need to do both. 2 weeks ago, the approach was to maintain the stitch count and use a larger percentage of the stitches for the heel. Now this widened and deepened the heel, which made the diagonal larger, but because we maintained the stitch count, the instep narrowed. The amount we gained in the diagonal was somewhat offset by the change in the instep width. For extreme fit issues, this can lead to a very large heel and a very narrow instep. Last week, we did not maintain the stitch count. We left the instep alone, but we worked increases in the heel stitches. That widened the heel and gave it more depth, which increased the diagonal. Any gains made in the diagonal of the heel were net gains to the circumference because there was no offsetting change in that instep width. For this approach, we have a choice of 3 different variations. This week we're going to leave the heel alone, and instead we're going to focus on increasing the width of the instep in order to increase the total circumference. Now this will work on socks that have a short row heel or a forethought peasant heel where you're placing waste yarn to mark the location of the heel later on. This won't work for a true afterthought heel where you're making your decision about heel placement after you've completed your sock tube. As with the previous videos, we need to know how much additional circumference we need to add in order to achieve good fit. Now I covered the calculations for this in last week's video, so you can go look at that if you are ready to make your calculations. But for the purposes of this video, we'll use the measurements for my feet and socks to go through the process. For my feet, I need a circumference around that heel diagonal to instep of 9.8 inches for a good fit. But my socks with no modifications would have a diagonal circumference of only 8.15 inches. So the difference between those two measurements is 1.65 inches. So I need to add 1.65 inches to the circumference of my sock for it to fit me. For the Instep Addition method of sock heel modification, multiply the 1.65 inches needed by the stitch gauge of 8 stitches per inch. That means I need 13.2 additional stitches. I can't add 13.2 stitches, so I round to the nearest multiple of 2 stitches. So therefore I need to add 14 stitches across my instep. Let's look at an example. In this swatch, the red portion represents the main sock tube. So if I was knitting cuff down in a textured stitch pattern, the entire red part would be in a textured stitch pattern. And as I began to do my increases, I would work the heel half of the sock in stockinette. If I'm working toe up, only the instep is going to have the texture, and I will just continue working the heel stitches in stockinette. So we're going to work the increases on the heel half of the sock, but we are going to work the actual heel only over the center span of stitches that represents the original stitch count. So I have a 56 stitch sock, so my heel will be 28 stitches across, regardless of how many stitches I add on this half of the sock. So when I begin my increases, I increase 2 stitches every round, and I increase them on the heel side, 1 stitch in from the edge. So I knit a stitch, work an increase. I use make 1 increases, and then I knit across until there's 1 stitch left. I do another make 1, and then I knit that last stitch. I continue working the instep in whatever stitch pattern I had started with. On the next round, I will work straight across in stockinette. So I'm going to alternate an increase round with a plain round until I have the total number of stitches I needed, which in my case was 14. Then I'm going to do that plain round, and I'm going to work across all of my extra heel stitches, and then I'm going to work my heel. So if I'm doing a short row heel, I would work across those center 28 stitches, working in shorter and shorter short rows, then longer and longer short rows. And when I completed my heel, I would then work across those extra stitches to the end of the round. I did a peasant heel here, so I worked across the extra stitches. Then I took my waste yarn and I knit across the 28 stitches with waste yarn. Then I returned back here, knit across them again with my regular yarn, and then finished the round. Later, I came and took the waste yarn out and put my heel in. Once the heel is placed, then you're going to work your decreases. Now, if you need the second half of your tube to be different in circumference than the first half, here's where you can make some adjustments. So assuming that you want the two tubes to be the same, you would work a decrease round and then a plain round. You would alternate your decrease rounds and plain rounds until you're down to your original count. If you need a larger leg, then you can stop your decreases sooner. As soon as you stop your decreases, if you're working toe up, then you could begin working the entire leg in texture. But until you have completed your decreases, you will continue working in stockinette. So the decreases are going to be worked at the edges in the first 2 stitches and the last 2 stitches. You're not going to knit a stitch and then work your decrease. You're going to work them in the first 2 and last 2. At this edge, you want a decrease that leans into the left, so an SSK or an SKP decrease. And at this edge, you want a decrease that leans to the right, so that would be a knit 2 together decrease. So when you are finished, you will have a line of stitches. You'll have the 1 stitch before the increases coming up to this point, and then you will have the decreases that are leaning toward the heel all here, and that will form one complete line of stockinette stitches, and that will frame your instep. So you can completely maintain your instep pattern, and it will be framed by a column of stockinette stitches on each side. If you are working the entire sock in stockinette stitch, you can work the increases on the actual instep half of the sock. You would work it exactly the same way. You'd place your increases 1 stitch in from the edge. You'd work every other round. When you completed your increases, then you would work around, you would work across your instep stitches, and then you would work the heel as described before. And then when you work your decreases, you will do the same thing, working in the edge stitches every other round until you have completed your decreases. What this does is create a different looking result. The instep stitches come all the way up to that line of increases and decreases, right up to a point where the heel begins, and it just looks different. I wouldn't recommend doing this if you are trying to maintain a pattern stitch across the instep, because you'll be interfering with the edge stitch of the instep with the increases and the decreases. Once again, the sock fits my foot with no problem. This is the one where I did the increases and decreases on the heel half, and this is the one where I did the increases and decreases on the instep half. So let's compare what these look like. This is the heel worked with the percentage system. This one is 75% of the stitches. I actually need 85. I'd need more than that for better fit. But you can see how large this heel is in relation to the instep. This is the sock heel that I worked last week, where I did increases before I worked the heel. So the heel is more in proportion with the instep because I don't have to increase that many stitches in the heel to get a better fit. And then this is this week's heel. So you can see that this sock ends up a little straighter. The turn from the leg to the foot is a little straighter, where with the percentage system it's a much more dramatic change. And again, that's partly due to my fit issues. And then this one is a little bit in between the two of them. There are a lot of ways to compare these 3 basic approaches to modifying the sock heel for a better fit. The one that is best is going to depend on your particular sock situation. If you have extreme fit issues like I have, you get more bang for your buck by adding stitches to the heel. For example, I need to add the 1.65 inches to my total circumference. In order to do that with the percentage system, I have to use 85% of the stitches, leaving me with a 1-inch instep. In other words, for a 56 stitch sock, I have to move 20 of the 28 instep stitches to the heel. If I use the method of just increasing the heel stitches, I only need to add 8 stitches or 1 inch worth of stitches to the heel to get the 1.65 additional circumference I need. And for the Instep Addition method, I need to add 14 stitches, which is 1 3/4 inches, to the instep in order to get the circumference that I need. And this can affect the proportions of heel to instep as well with the extreme fit issues, which is another reason that I tend to prefer just adding stitches to the heel. It creates a more balanced looking sock for me, but for people who have much more modest heel fit issues, the decision is really up to you and what you prefer. If you have any questions or comments about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or you can join me over in my Ravelry group, Roxanne. There's a link to that down in the description. If you'd like to see the complete playlist for this series, you can click on the box above here, or if you'd like to see all of my sock related videos, you can click on the playlist down below there. If you haven't subscribed to my channel already, I'd love it if you did. You can hover over my face here and then click on the subscribe button, or if you're on a mobile device, tap on my face and then tap on subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.